The explanation of the supernova explosion becomes easy if we accept the idea of metallic hydrogen nucleus. I'm proud to present for the first time ever the idea why and how the supernova explosion happens according to my thesis, according to idea of metallic nucleus, metallic hydrogen nucleus. After a billion of years, the fusion of hydrogen into helium in corona of the star loses its initial dynamic, so the star slowly calms down. There is lack of fuel because almost all possible fuel has already gone. According to my thesis, the fusion still exists in the upper layers of the corona of the red dwarf. Also, the metallic hydrogen nucleus still exists in the core of every red dwarf. There is huge pressure and relatively high temperature, conditions that allow hydrogen to remain in the solid metallic form according to my thesis and according to rules of nature. In these conditions, under specific temperature, which is critical to transition from metallic to liquid and gas hydrogen, probably the temperature slightly over the temperature of 2000 Kelvin degrees, the metallic hydrogen nucleus of the red dwarf, slowly cooling in space, still contains a huge amount of the nuclear fuel. This is highly explosive material. It can make really huge explosion, especially in case of the giant red dwarfs, with size of thousands of our suns. If only hydrogen could be released from the metallic nucleus and could change into gas, it would become fuel for the supernova explosion. This is the main idea. According to my thesis, when a red dwarf is cooling, the temperature inside its core becomes lower and lower and lower, and one day it reaches the critical value, probably slightly below 2000 Kelvin degrees. Below the critical temperature, the metallic hydrogen is melting very rapidly. It changes into liquid and gas hydrogen in seconds. This is part of my thesis. The process is similar to ice melting, but it is much faster, much more dynamic. The transformation is almost immediate. The hydrogen evaporates from metallic hydrogen nucleus and becomes the fuel for the supernova explosion. The model explains why only red dwarfs can participate in the supernova, the other dwarfs not. It is linked to critical temperature. So let's take a look on the scientific model of the supernova explosion now. The scientific model of the supernova explosion is not related to the temperature. So according to scientific model, it is inexplicable why only red dwarfs can produce supernova. Questions without answers. In the scientific model, key role plays implosion of the surface of the red dwarf. According to this model, in the result of the thermonuclear fusion, elements heavier than hydrogen and helium are produced. The huge amount of energy is emitted by the star in the form of thermal radiation, the emission of light and high energy light, as well as X-rays, alpha, beta, and gamma rays. These phenomena are accompanied by the emission of free particles, free electrons, free neutrons, and protons escaping from the star into the outer space in all possible directions. In the result of the fusion, the mass of the star is relatively smaller at the end of its life than it was at the beginning. All stars shrink in size, and such stars are called dwarfs because of that. There is a lot of types of dwarfs. Let me count only some of them. At first, the dying star turns into something scientists call white dwarf, and then into the red dwarf, after that into brown dwarf, and finally into black dwarf. There is a lot of other dwarfs in between. Names come from the color temperature of light emitted by these dying stars, because dwarfs are in fact dying stars. White light is emitted by the matter as hot as about 6000 Kelvin degrees, so the color of the light is 6000 kelvins, which seems to be for us daylight, and consequently the dwarf which possesses the temperature of light, like this, is called white dwarf. Surprisingly and interestingly, light coming from our sun measured on the surface of the Earth planet has 5 to 6000 kelvins. So according to the definition, we should call our sun white dwarf. I think that this conclusion should be alarming to us because the next stage of dying star is red dwarf. The temperature of white dwarfs and red dwarfs follows their names. The red dwarf is much colder than the white dwarf, and because of that it emits red light equal in color to the temperature it possesses. The red light color temperature is approximately 2000 kelvins. According to scientific model, the conditions inside the core of red dwarf still allowed hydrogen to convert into helium in the process of thermonuclear fusion, but almost no fuel left there. It's almost gone, and because of that, the red dwarf is cooling. I remind you that according to my thesis, the fusion cannot be located in the core of the dwarf because it is present in the corona of it. According to scientists, stars are constantly shrinking because the fusion inside them produces many heavier elements with bigger atomic numbers, which take much less space than hydrogen does. This is the reason why inside the red dwarf there is a lot of empty space. One day, when forces of gravity overcome the forces of thermonuclear fusion, the surface of the dwarf implodes. The equilibrium between forces of gravity and forces of the fusion is broken, and the shell collapses. Remains of the shell hit the core of the star, where, according to scientists, the thermonuclear fusion is still present, and in this way the supernova explosion is triggered. Why this model is false? Number one, without the proposed idea of metallic hydrogen nucleus, which is according to me the real fuel for the supernova explosion, there would be no explosive material necessary to cause the explosion on such a cosmic scale. There would be nothing to explode inside the red dwarf, just remains of the fusion inside the core of the red dwarf. These forces would be incompatible. Supernova changes red dwarf into plasma and widespread it for light years in outer space. The energy given is much bigger than the energy of the implosion. The amount of energy given by the implosion of the red dwarf is not equal to the amount of energy which gives the supernova explosion. They are incompatible. The implosion is bordered to the size of the red dwarf. It cannot produce such a disaster, the complete destruction of the giant red dwarf with mass of thousands of our suns just in a few seconds. The supernova explosion is much, much stronger than any implosion could be. If so, the question is, what is the fuel of the explosion like this? In my model, this is hydrogen from metallic hydrogen nucleus, which could be as big as half of the giant red dwarf. In the scientific model, just the core of the red dwarf with remains of the fusion. Number two, if the supernova explosion would be limited only to forces of implosion and no other kind of fuel would participate in it, the origin of black holes would be inexplicable too. The energy given by the implosion would be too weak to produce black hole in place of the giant red dwarf. Number three, the localization of the fusion inside star's body is only hypothetical. There is no proof for that. We know that the corona of the star is much hotter than the surface of the star. Must be some reason for that. If we would locate the thermonuclear fusion in the corona of the star, as I proposed in my thesis, the model would be simpler, more elegant, and more logical. There is strong proof for such a localization. The corona of the star is hot. There is millions of Celsius degrees. Only fusion could cause the temperature like this. In the scientific model, the temperature of the corona of the star is inexplicable. Questions without answers. The scientific idea of the equilibrium between forces of thermonuclear fusion and forces of gravity of the star is inconsistent. According to the idea, forces of gravity directed inwardly with time can overcome forces of thermonuclear fusion, which are directed outwardly. In fact, both forces should be weaker and weaker in the same time, because when the fusion is weaker, the forces of gravity also must be weaker due to loss of mass of the red dwarf, which is the consequence of the thermonuclear fusion. If so, why the equilibrium between these two forces could be broken? What would cause the implosion? There is no explanation, only questions with no answers, and as you know, this is typical for false thesis. Number 5. In the scientific model, all the body of the star and dwarf participates in the fusion. If so, why the temperature on the surface of the star is relatively low, only 5000 Celsius degrees? If fusion would take place inside the red dwarf, the hypothetical temperature should be counted in 100 millions of Celsius degrees inside the star or dwarf. Such a temperature should warm the surface of the sun significantly during billions of years of activity. The fusion should be present on the surface of the star as well. It doesn't. In the scientific model, there is no explanation why. Number 6. If the thermonuclear fusion would take place inside the star, which all consist of hydrogen, as scientists claim, what could border the area where the thermonuclear fusion exists from the area where the same kind of fuel cannot participate in the fusion? Scientists can't answer this question. According to them, the fusion for some reason takes place in the core of the star, but not on the surface of it. They can't propose any reasonable explanation why all the star's body cannot participate in the fusion and just blow up. In the scientific model, there is no explanation. This is number 8. Why only red dwarfs can produce the supernova? The temperature of the red dwarf is not directly related to the supernova. If so, why, according to scientific model, the other dwarfs, like white or brown or black or another, cannot participate in the supernova? No reasonable explanation, more questions and no answer, which is typical for false thesis. Explanation number 7. The proposed scientific model of equilibrium between forces of thermonuclear fusion, which according to scientists is a kind of constant explosion, and between forces of gravity of dwarf, would be similar to the model of the grenade, which already exploded, but its shell is so strong that it cannot blow up. It would be a very strange model, don't you think? The model is similar to impossible figure. In this model, the border for the explosion inside the star's body would be the fuel necessary to make the explosion, the hydrogen, compressed by the forces of gravity. Imagine the grenade, which is made not only from the explosive material located inside it, but also the shell of it is made from the explosive material. The explosive material inside the shell exploded, but the shock wave, for some reason, was stopped by the shell made of the same explosive material. According to the model, when forces of gravity overcome the forces of explosion, the shell collapses. This kind of equilibrium scientists proposed to explain the supernova explosion. Scientists insist that the gravity itself can border the chain reaction in the huge thermonuclear bomb the size of the red dwarf, with mass of thousands of our suns. If all of the body of the red dwarf could participate in the fusion, the dwarf would rather explode because the forces of the shock wave would transmit the explosion to the explosive in the neighborhood, and the explosion would easily overcome the forces of the gravity. This model is false. This is impossible figure. I already proposed my model of the supernova explosion, but now let's go into details. According to my thesis, when the star is cooling and it changes into the red dwarf, there is a moment when the temperature inside the red dwarf on the outer layer of the metallic nucleus made of hydrogen reaches the critical value discussed before, approximately 2000 Kelvin degrees. It must be temperature below the temperature of the red dwarf, close to 2000 Kelvin degrees. This physical fact initiates the massive dramatic change of the metallic hydrogen nucleus inside the giant red dwarf. The metallic hydrogen nucleus changes into liquid and gas hydrogen, forms possible in the existing temperature and pressure inside the dwarf. At the moment when only the temperature will decrease below the critical value, in a few seconds a huge portion of the metallic hydrogen nucleus transforms rapidly into liquid and gas. This must happen in seconds, according to the rules of physics, and nothing can stop this process. According to rules of physics, the transition must go on when the temperature becomes too low to keep hydrogen in the metallic form in the pressure, which is constant there. If the temperature on the surface of the nucleus will be below the critical value, the massive change of really huge amount of the metallic hydrogen nucleus into liquid and gas must be the result. This transformation is similar to the chain reaction because it is connected with rapid decompression, and the decompression makes the temperature inside the dwarf even lower and lower and lower in a split of second. The bigger is the massive decompression from metallic to liquid and from liquid to gas form, the lower the temperature inside the core of dwarf is, because the compression is always accompanied by the freezing effect. The temperature of the outer layer of the nucleus in the result of the decompression must be also lower and lower, which must cause the faster and faster transition of the metallic hydrogen nucleus into liquid and gas. In this way, the nucleus is significantly diminishing just in a few seconds, and the giant red dwarf extends significantly its size. Liquid and gas hydrogen has to expand the size of the red dwarf in this spectacular way, just in a few seconds, and a few seconds before the supernova explosion. In the same time, a few seconds before the supernova explosion, deeply inside the metallic hydrogen nucleus, the temperature could still be high enough to resist the transformation into liquid and gas. According to this model, the nucleus cannot change into liquid and gas form all at once, if only it is big enough, as it is in case of giant red dwarfs. The process of transition has direction from the surface of the nucleus, where the temperature could be critical, to the center of the nucleus, which could have higher temperature, and at some point it can stop the transition, preserving the huge portion of metallic hydrogen nucleus from the process of transformation into liquid and gas, if only the temperature and pressure inside the nucleus would be over the critical values. It happens only to giant red dwarfs. In the result of all dramatic changes described above, the color of the surface of the red dwarfs changes in seconds from orange to bluish. This is the color of liquid and gas hydrogen. Hydrogen evaporates from the core of red dwarf and expands the red dwarf in size significantly. It happens seconds before the supernova explosion, as I said. The liquid and gas hydrogen on the surface of the red dwarf is warmed by the corona of the dwarf, where the fusion still exists. It evaporates quickly to the atmosphere. Warmed atoms of hydrogen go up and up toward the corona of the giant red dwarf, where the temperature is high enough to keep the fusion. When hot hydrogen atoms will be warmed enough, and when they lost all neutrons attracted by the gravity of the star, and when protons of hydrogen reach the corona of the red dwarf, where protons are exposed to the existing remnants of the thermonuclear fusion, which still take place in the upper layers of the corona of the red dwarf, the immediate thermonuclear explosion on mass scale occurs. It happens just seconds after the massive transition of the metallic nucleus from metallic to liquid and gas hydrogen. This is the real explanation of the supernova explosion. The supernova is related to the temperature in my model. In case of massive dwarf, part of the gigantic nucleus, due to its big size, cannot participate in the supernova explosion because the explosion occurs too fast to give it a chance to change from metallic to liquid and gas hydrogen. The huge portion of the metallic hydrogen nucleus still remains inside the dwarf when the blow up of the supernova already is in progress. From this huge portion of the nucleus, the black hole is made.